My fear was now of another kind. I felt sure that the creature was what we call good, but I wasn't sure whether I liked goodness so much as I had supposed. This is a very terrible experience. As long as what you are afraid of is something evil, you may still hope that the good may come to your rescue. But suppose you struggle through to the good and find that it also is dreadful.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 2, Perelandra, Chapter 1, The Journey to Ransom's Cottage. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite C.S. Lewis podcast, run by three Fulcandrians, Andrew, David, and myself, Matt. This season, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra. And today we're diving into Chapter 1. This kind of feels like the official begin to the season. I know we did the welcome. I know you've already heard our voices for this new season, but when you jump into the book, you're getting into the meat. So, gentlemen, how are you guys doing? How are you feeling about the book? You excited to be diving into this?
I'm kind of over Lewis.
Yeah, over the moon about Lewis, head over heels with Lewis.
I was at a dinner with a gentleman from the church community, and I was just asking him about his life and stuff and interests and hobby, classic stuff when you just meet a new individual. And doesn't know I do anything with Lewis. Somehow it just kind of come up naturally, though. I was like, oh, what do you think of Lewis? I'm not a big fan. I think he's very dystopian. I was like, yeah. Okay.
I think you're dystopian.
I appreciated the honesty.
What people often dislike about Lewis is often more projection, and certainly usually comes from an incomplete or an inconsistent reading with him. There are some times, maybe 5 in the last 20 years, where I felt like, I'm a little tired of Lewis right now. But 5 in 20 years where I think about him every day, right?
Andrew, there's a great quote on this. There's not 100 people who know the true Catholic Church. I mean, C.S. Lewis, and disagree with it. Just millions that disagree with what they wrongly perceive to be the Catholic Church. I mean, C.S. Lewis.
That was a good perversion of Fault Machine.
Well, it's just kidding. The Christian ideal, or C.S. Lewis, has not been tried and found wanting. He's been found difficult and left untried.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's true. People come in, oh, he's racist. Oh, he's sexist. And I'm like, really? Okay. Bear that out. No, you can't? Okay, great. Shut up and read another book. Says my kind and generous pastoral heart.
People can already tell how the season is going to go. All of us three co-hosts, we're coming in hot, ready to defend Lewis. We're coming in fiery. We are just ready to battle the spiritual battle against the negative, hostile Eldil of our territory of Thakandra.
And any unmen we find along the way.
Yes. Remember that when Lewis made the cathedral of his favorite books, there were 2 at the top, and they were Perelandra and Till We Have Faces, both being about Venus. And of course, this is, he was in some ways waiting all of his life for Venus to invade and to come and to be with him in the form of Joy Davidman. So we see Lewis pushing towards a kind of culmination here.
Well, gentlemen, what are we drinking to kick off this season?
Well, I had a new shipment from Best Day Brewing. Finally, their Electro Lime beer is now available. It was sold out the last time I tried to do an order. So that's what I'm going to be chugging away with. And of course, a cup of tea because it's early in the morning.
Yes. No surprise, Oxford mug and San Antonio blend this morning.
I'm going to do my Guinness Zero. So I had a party where I bought multiple non-alcoholic beers, and they did not have Guinness Zero. This is for people who are interested in reducing alcohol intake because they've listened to a Huberman episode. Actually, someone did a study. He is drastically changing the way people think about alcohol, by the way. But anyway, set that aside. They were all terrible. I don't know if it's like what Guinness is made out of, where just, again, I don't know the difference between an IPA, a pale ale, some of these other ones, but maybe like the hoppiness is really hard to recreate in a non-alcoholic sense. But because Guinness is not hoppy, it tastes, to me, Guinness Zero tastes very similar to Guinness. I thoroughly enjoy it. But these other three, like there's a Blue Moon. It just was not good, non-alcoholic, to be blunt. It just tastes like a citrusy drink. So anyways, that's just a little side tangent.
And our hopes for sponsorship from non-alcoholic breweries just go down the tubes. Thanks, Matt.
well, I'm a big fan of Best Day Brewing, and I think their IPAs are very good. And I'm a guy who doesn't really like IPAs, so maybe I'm not the person to speak to it, but I really like their stuff.
I was looking online related to beer, and I found a place called Pinter, and it's like a home brew kit. Like they sell you the mixes, and they sell you the contraption. And you brew your own. And I don't know that I've got the commitment to that, but one of their kits was for a bitter. And it's like, man, if I could brew bitter beer at home, I don't think I'd ever leave.
I like it. I'm a little disappointed. I realized I missed a chance in the beginning of the season to drink the C.S. Lewis beer that I have from that place in Texas that I brought back. Well, Mary Margaret brought back for me. I went to a wedding. Literally, this brewery loves the Inklings. And they have a C.S. Lewis beer. And the problem is we're always drinking it in the morning, but to be blunt, I should have just sacrificed it for this sake because you can't keep a beer forever. And so I should have drank it. It'll probably come out soon here. We are toasting Patreon supporter Becca Brown, who has upgraded from the gold tier to the platinum tier. I didn't even realize we have a platinum tier. So thank you very much, Becca. That is just incredible. And so our toast today is going to be the quote from the beginning, an inspiration of that in the vein of that, because we're going to talk about that later. I think it's so beautiful. Whenever you encounter goodness in your life, may you receive it with joy, warmth, and humility. Cheers.
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 Now, typically we jump in, but we're at the beginning of the season, and I really wanted to, this was something I really wanted to do in the beginning. 2 requests from our listeners. If you can pause what you're doing actually. And particularly this first one. So our podcast currently on iTunes, which is the one I use, so that's the only one I see, has 515 ratings, which is wonderful. Just wonderful. If you can go and give us a rating, obviously preferably 5 stars, but we like authenticness, as Lewis says.
Authenticity.
We
like it in vocabulary too.
Don't do the rating based on Matt's vocabulary. It would be super helpful. We're trying to get to 750 to 1,000. The reason for this is not pure vanity. It's 80% vanity. It is genuinely because we've been very blessed to bring really wonderful guests on, and we're constantly trying to bring more and more high quality guests. Probably the number one thing I'm guessing some of them look at that are more curious about this is the reviews. How many you have? I mean, if you're a podcast with 10, they kind of know you don't have a great listener base. The more you have allows us to have a little bit more pull with some of these guests. And so we're going to do an appeal for the next few episodes. If you guys can go, just literally stop what you're doing, press the button. You don't even have to leave a review. We do love reading those. So if you do, that'd be even wonderful. But just click it, give the stars, and then come back to this. The second thing is a mini appeal in the beginning of the season. We don't do this super often because we keep our costs super lean and we don't pay ourselves. So we've been very blessed with our Patreon to more or less cover our costs, which has been such a gift. But if you feel called at the beginning of the season to support us on Patreon at any level, that would be absolutely a gift to us as we continue to every year think through new things that we can add. And that obviously increases the costs pretty continuously every single year subtly. That would be fantastic. And so just remember, there's different gifts at different levels. You can join the Slack community, which is such a gift. We're probably getting somewhat close to like 200 people part of that community. As that grows, and maybe this season we can break through that. It's just a wonderful community. So anyways, we would love for you guys to do both of those things. I'll probably bring this up for a couple more episodes beginning of the season, and then we will be done with those kind of appeal for support.
Lovely. We will not, like NPR, pepper the whole episode with, right when you get to the best part of whatever NPR is doing. And now let's bring you back to the studio and beg you for more money. We're grateful for your support.
A public service announcement from David Bates. He particularly appreciates support because this allows him to see his family as it grows. The reason this podcast is able to operate at, I would argue, a high quality from the content, from the production side of things, and from the amount of content, with like zero, pay for myself, Andrew, and David, is because David is effectively like an executive assistant for this, doing all of the managerial. Actually, he's like a manager, advisor, CEO that literally like does all this. So the more we take from him away, allows him to be with his family, or the more he puts towards this is less time with his family. So that's also part of this. It's just it's a gift. He gives not only of his talent, but also of his time quite significantly. So anyways, without further ado, let's jump into the chapter summary.
Yeah. And as we move into this discussion portion of the episode, I'd like to repeat that we're really going to try and avoid spoilers this season as we read. So if you're reading chapter by chapter along with us, hopefully we're not going to spoil anything for the future chapters. But let's kick things off with one of my 100-word summaries of chapter 1. In response to a wire, our narrator is travelling to Elwyn Ransom's cottage. As he walks from Worcester Station, he experiences a strange sense of foreboding. The landscape appears ominous, and he experiences a repeated impulse to turn back. Arriving at the darkened cottage, he finds a note from Ransom saying that he'll be back later. Upon entering the cottage, he trips over a strange box on the floor. Then, a cylinder of light, whom he understands to be a manifestation of the Oyasa of Malacandra, calls out for Ransom, who enters the cottage himself a few moments later. I have to say, it's been a while since I've had to write one of those 100-word summaries. It's really difficult trying to boil everything down.
Well done indeed.
Well, is there anything that you guys would like to say as this chapter opens?
I just rated the podcast 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
all it took was being co-host and being an integral part of it for multiple years, and Andrew's finally done it.
Yes, absolutely. So if I can, you can. One of the things that pops out here, and it's a theme that starts to come up a little bit in Lewis's life, right around this time, and we got to remember the context. This is written, the first mention we hear of the writing of Perelandra is late in 1941 in a letter from Lewis. So 41 is when he is writing Preface to Paradise Lost, where he deals with the devil. It's when he's doing the radio talks that become Mere Christianity, which talks about the devil. He's also writing the Screwtape Letters, which clearly deal with the devil. And so you've got a real cluster of Lewis's thinking around this time. One of the things that comes up is the question of emotion versus intellect. And when I actually read the Screwtape Letters, the original ones, the actual paper with Lewis's tea stains and everything, in the Berg collection of the New York Public Library, there's a section where he says, think of your man as a series of 3 concentric circles. His fantasy on the outside, his intellect next, and then his will. And he had inserted, but then crossed out, emotion in there as well. And so while I think it's far too facile and untrue to just say Lewis was afraid of emotion, emotion was something that Lewis really grappled with. And in this chapter, you see that struggle between his emotion and then his intellectual or analytical side, just trying to deal with what's going on. And of course, as we see in the chapter, emotion wins over to some degree.
No, I'm excited about that part of this. We're going to talk about this within this chapter directly, but I got that exact same sense. And if you remember in the last book, there was a journey. There was emotion versus knowledge and intellect. As the unknown became more known and the knowledge started to increase, it was able to overcome some of that emotion. But there was just a lot of life lessons in there. And since we're not doing spoilers, I'm not going to move anything beyond this chapter, but we see that in this chapter clearly starting to play out. And you see that with just his journey to Ransom's cottage. And it felt eerily similar of that dynamic that we saw in Malacandra. So I'm looking forward to that. Before getting into this, I'll say it reminded me, first of all, of Dr. Glyer when we jumped into Diana. When you had a chance to, I think I just love Dr. Glyer, the way that rolls off the tongue.
Professor Glyer.
It's just not as natural to me.
I'll stop now.
This is just too ingrained, a neural pathway. When I read this a second time, because I did this part in Oxford already, I was just able to slow down, and I was able to experience the feelings that the chapter elicits. And I'm presuming this book. And Diana did the same thing for us, Andrew, when we were in that conversation. She read part of Perelandra. And that was like the first time I really realized the beauty, because I tend to read this with the thought process of, what am I going to say on the episode? What's important? What's the structure? What are the main themes? Rather than just like receiving the feeling, the experiential.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciated that, I guess. I noticed the reference face to face, by the way.
Yes. Well, cheers to Matt for picking up an idea.
Yes, cheers to me.
Cheers to Matt.
Yeah, we'll just pause there. We'll pause there.
He doesn't even know why I'm cheersing him.
He doesn't care.
I don't
cheers
care.
to Matt.
He doesn't care. Cheers to Matt. In a book that Matt won't read for 10 years until we do it, Experiment in Criticism, Lewis talks about two ways of approaching a book. And one is to receive a book, and another is to use a book. A romance novel, you're using it for a certain thrill. You're not receiving it as this literary opus, which isn't to say that some books that have romance in them are not, highly literary. But Lewis really wants the reader to receive even a bad book rather than to try to use it to titillate, their own hungers or needs or whatever. Yeah, that distinction, I think, is good. Let me receive what's here. Let me read what the author actually wrote, rather than imposing my own selfishness on it and say, what can I get out of this book? You find the same distinction, the enjoyed versus the contemplated. This is meditation in a tool shed. You find a similar expression in Screw Tape. We want the man to be to obey rather than to be a taster, a connoisseur when it comes to church. And so, but yeah, to receive the book that's before us, whether or not we like it or not. And usually, I think Lewis is wise to point out, we don't even know well enough whether we like it because, we haven't read enough or given the book a fair enough chance, perhaps.
But we will give this book a chance.
Yes, we shall.
Well, and let me say one more thing before David kind of puts some of his thoughts. This thing read, the first chapter, like a psychological thriller.
Yes. Which is a new genre. It's a relatively new genre in the history of literature. By the way, I pulled up my transcription of the original Screw Tape Letter manuscript.
The OG.
And it says, think of your man as a series of concentric circles. And originally he wrote, his will being innermost, his emotions coming next, then his intellect, and finally his fantasy. And he says, will being innermost, he crosses out emotion, puts intellect next. So he eliminates emotions as next closest to the will. So we'll see some of that kind of happening in Ransom. We also saw it in Ransom when he was struck by terror on Malacandra and just ran headlong into the forest and was starting to go crazy. And when he begins to come into his right mind, and when he stopped being in his feelings, that's when he began to perceive things well. And of course, perception is going to be a huge theme in this book too.
That ties us with my main point, that a lot of this feels like Out of the Silent Planet. There are similarities in the way the book begins, walking in fading light. But as Matt says, this one is far more spooky and psychological, and he's ratcheted it up a few more points. But one thing that's probably worth mentioning is that we don't find out who the narrator is in this chapter. But I do think if someone's read Out of the Silent Planet, particularly the end, they could make an educated guess that this is the fictional C.S. Lewis in the story.
Yes.
And there's actually even echoes of Lewis's own arrival at Oxford that he talks about in Surprised by Joy.
Oh, nice
with
pickup.
This Lewis's journey to Ransom's cottage. One thing I did want to point out as the resident Englishman, where's this Worcester? Because firstly, it's pronounced Worcester, even in the audiobooks. But it's spelt differently from the city that's near Birmingham, which is actually pretty close to where I used to live, about 30 miles away when I lived in England. And we're going to find out later in the chapter that Ransom has nipped over to Cambridge. And that's quite a way away. So I'm going to give my scholarly opinion. I think that this is a fictional place. I don't think this is the Worcester of England.
Okay, well, that trumps me because I looked up the 1:15 train from Oxford to Worcester.
But it's long. It's quite a journey. And so I think if he's had to nip out last minute, probably not. And also the spelling's different.
Yes, yeah. And he would have paid attention to that. And then, no spoiler, but in That Hideous Strength, he also makes up a fictional university.
I think we're in the wrong fiction. And there's actually a bit at the beginning of the book where he gives the disclaimer that you often see at the end of movies. It's like, all the people here are fictitious. but you can very clearly see some influences.
Yes, absolutely.
And one thing I wanted to say before we actually dig into the meat of it, I think it's worth pointing out that it's autumn. The text says it, and it also talks about red and yellowish trees. And since, no spoiler, because we've already said this, that we know we're going to go to Venus, these red and yellowish trees are a nice contrast to the green fertility of Venus. Whereas here on Thulkandra, we are in autumn and everything is now starting to die.
Yeah. A dying fecundity. Yes, good. And autumn, of course, was Lewis's favorite season.
As it is for all right-thinking people.
It is indeed. And they pronounce it autumn instead of fall.
Yes, because we don't have to name our seasons over what the leaves are doing.
Or man did in the beginning.
Well, I think Lewis does a really good job of actually recapping the events of Out of the Silent Planet through this first chapter, weaving it into his own character's journey along the way. And as we hear the narrator's thoughts, he appears quite bothered by Ransom's trip to Mars. What is it in particular that seems to be unsettling him?
Well, we'll touch on it a little bit later in the chapter 2, but the quote is, there's this burden of intolerable strangeness. And one of the things that Lewis excoriated, one of the things he hated about science fiction is when they would take the same human soap opera and just set it in a different backdrop. For him, the strangeness in this sense of being other than what I have experienced, that was really attractive to him. And one of the spurs to write a set of science fiction books was what would happen if I take a person and put him in a different world, and what are the spiritual ramifications? And of course, charmingly, Hyoy begins to teach Ransom his catechism. There's a quote in Magician's Nephew, which is the last of the Narnias to be written, but it's also about Venus, right? That's the planet over Magician's Nephew. And I think that there's a connection because this is about Venus, that's about Venus, and of course, Lewis's best book is about Venus. But Diggory Kirk says, just think of what another world might mean. You might find anything. And then you find in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Peter says, that old chap will let us do anything we like. And so anything is a word to conjure with in Lewis. And so he's looking forward to space travel to see something that is truly different, not just geographically, not just topographically, not just linguistically, but he's looking at what real difference might mean. One of the things about reading that Lewis lauded was, the chance that reading offers us to see with other eyes. And so when you go to a completely different planet, you should not expect the same stuff that you find on Earth. And that scares the willies out of the narrator, Lewis.
I'll say there's the superficial part of your friend changing. That's what kind of stuck out to me here at first. Do you remember kind of Lewis talking about that in one of his other books of just like, we don't love when that change kind of happens.
It's in the Four Loves.
There we go. That's why we keep you around, David.
Which is the novelization or the prose version of which, never mind.
But I would say, he's more importantly, he's bothered by the communication with the Eldil. He feels there is still some sort of connection, some sort of communication, and there's the unfamiliar with that.
Yeah, he seems to be unsettled by the very trip to Mars that Ransom underwent. Wonderful line. He says, a man who's been to another world does not come back unchanged.
Yes.
But also the fact that he's met these strange creatures, the Eldil, that's also bad. But what's even worse is he says, well, it seems like he's been receiving visitors, capital V, at his cottage. Basically, these people aren't leaving him alone. Mm-hmm. And just to circle back to your reference to the Four Loves, Matt, the other thing that Lewis says throughout his works in lots of different places is the tension in a relationship when one person converts. Mm-hmm. And Ransom has clearly had a conversion, not of the traditional kind, but he has now been radically changed. And that's introduced a strain, even though they weren't friends, seemingly, even before this began. A man who's been to another world doesn't come back unchanged.
Yeah. That's a really good insight, David, because he's in the middle of, or towards the end of, his tension with Mrs. Moore, who never became a Christian and who kind of derided Lewis's conversion. Lewis had been to another world, right? And it was coming back changed, and that created some tension even in his own home. And so, yeah, I think that there's some metaphorical stuff to being in touch with someone from heaven. And remember what Lewis said in, I think it's the chapter on pride. In Mere Christianity, he says, the real test of being in the presence of God, or in this case, being in the presence of something holy and other, is that either you don't think about yourself at all, you stop thinking about yourself at all, or you consider yourself a very small and dirty thing. Small meaning proportionally small, dirty meaning in comparison to God's ultimate holiness. But the best thing, Lewis says, is not to think of oneself at all. And that's what's dominating this chapter is the narrator is thinking about himself and his own reactions and not thinking about the possibilities that are before him, which are quite literally heavenly possibilities.
Yeah. And one of the things that as he's thinking, he realizes that he's afraid. But what is he actually afraid of?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he's very bothered by the Idilla. And so very similar to Ransom in the last book, the lack of knowledge. There's just this fear that is kind of automatically created. And so we're seeing that play out again a second time. But in this case, he does identify it as twofold. He's afraid that sooner or later might actually find himself meeting an Idil. And then he's also, my notes say, Afrida, that he might get drawn in. I mean, I'd be afraid of that as well.
In that, I hear such echoes of Surprised by Joy, because it's Lewis's repeated assertion. He just wants to be left alone. He doesn't want to get drawn into anything.
Right.
And in Perelandra, he says that he's feeling like he's being dragged into interplanetary politics.
Right.
And politics was another thing that Lewis didn't care for.
Well, and part of why he doesn't care for it is he sees that it causes bloodshed, in Ireland. I mean, he's in Ireland during the 1916 revolution and all the rest of it. There's also this sense of the numinous. And I think I mentioned in my notes later on, but I'll use it now, that the fear of Father Christmas when the children see him. Some pictures make him look only jolly and happy, but when they found him in person, it wasn't quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that the children became very quiet, very still. They felt very solemn, but also very glad, but also solemn. And so there's this fear of the Lord. When we see Jane in that hideous strength, fearing the community at St. Anne's. And yeah, like you said, this fear of being drawn into Christianity, that there might be more to the world than I thought. And so I think, literally, it's the fear of the Lord. But fortunately, that fear grappled with will produce wisdom, as the scriptures promise.
No, this is amazing. We're in the first episode here of the book, and I did not pick up any of that theme. I was taking this all just very literally within the story. I never really thought about that metaphor of Ransom's a person that's encountered the divine, had a conversion experience. You're the friend that's like, man, I really trust this individual. I really believe them. They're asking me, but I'm like afraid maybe I get drawn in. Maybe I meet whatever this person met. Maybe this Christian, I never really thought about that extension of that analogy. I'm really liking that. Well done, guys. Well done. My good and faithful servants. And
there are repeated references to luck and accident in this section. He talks about it being an accident that he even knows Ransom. But if the narrator, Lewis, had read the end of the chapter on friendship in The Four Loves, he would know that really there are no accidents, that there's a divine coordinator who's behind all of this.
Well, and some of what Lewis is grappling with is the intersection between what he says he believes and then what happens when he actually faces it, right? And that's so much of what Lewis is about. If he believes something, he does something about it. And for him, and we'll find this later with Ransom, the abstract becomes quite real. And that's part of what Lewis is finding now. This is about 10 years into his conversion, into his Christian conversion. And he's really kind of coming down to brass tacks. He's also beginning to suffer the slings and arrows in Oxford for being a public Christian. And so the reality of being a Christian is really starting to take a toll. That bliss that Lewis talks about, and I think in Mere Christianity, that bliss after one converts, and that's great. But then to grind it out, right? To obey when one doesn't feel like obeying. This is some of what's going on here, and some of what we're seeing Lewis portrayed in Ransom. And I hadn't really noticed that particularly until we talked about it today. So kudos.
Well, I want to get on with the story in a moment, but I just want to dwell on the Eldilla just for one more little bit. What is it about them that narrator Lewis says is so unsettling? What's so odd about them?
Frank Peretti, of course.
For those of you of my generation or the next, for boomers and Gen X, you'll remember that Frank Peretti wrote a book called This Present Darkness. And it was a novel about characters in a town, and it pulls back the veil between the spiritual world and the real world. And so you see angelic characters, both demonic and heavenly, interacting with humans and with events. And so one of the things that Lewis is doing here is pulling back the veil and realizing that there are these other life forces in the universe that science is really not accounted for. And so I think that's some of what he's freaking out about.
And that's some of what Matt meant when he was reading your notes and saw the word Frank Peretti.
Yes. Yeah. I did look this up, David, because I was curious, because he essentially talks about the supernatural versus the scientific camp, more like the natural, supernatural. And typically you throw things into two distinct categories. So think Martians versus angels. And this seemed to bridge them together, highly intelligent, like an angelic type creature, but with the material side of it. And it also said, Selenites or something, which was part of H.G. Wells. I looked that up. I wanted to see what it was.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Oh, it means of Selena the moon.
Yes. Thanks for stealing my thunder, Andrew.
You mean the Greek mythology that everybody should know and have on the tip of their tongue? Sure. No worries.
Never even heard that name before.
I found this section actually kind of funny because he talks about, we label things scientific or supernatural.
Right.
These elements become very different when you A, meet them, and B, when you realize that as far as the Eldilla go, it's sort of both. It's science fiction and supernatural. And that's part of another argument that you often hear in this world. It's like, what's the difference between sci-fi and fantasy? And actually, is there much of a difference between the two?
Well, and then part of this too is the worldviews of Tolkien and Lewis. So Lewis is one for whom religion comes crashing in. It's not his native land, and he comes crashing into it, or it comes crashing into him, and there's an abrupt introduction of religion that he then tries to integrate into his life. But Tolkien's worldview is one where the whole thing begins within the context of religion. There's always a Iluvatar, Eru, the one. There's the one God in the Lord of the Rings behind it all. And for Tolkien, having been raised Catholic and remaining Catholic, there is this whole religious universe in which the story of the Lord of the Rings plays out, which is part of why you have the easy interaction between elves and men, the often easy interaction, and then even the rapprochement between dwarves and elves. You've got and the elves are eternal, right? And so you've got a universe where the eternal and the temporal are working together, which is very typical of your average Catholic housewife praying to a saint, but is not very typical of Lewis's own experience. And so that's, I think, part of what's going on. Lewis is confronted by the strangeness of the eternal. Tolkien has no trouble with the eternal, and for him, it's not strange. It comes to help, it doesn't come to invade. And that's a contrast between the way that they saw things, and this is some of the evidence that you see Lewis pronouncing here.
And a wonderful book on that subject, if anyone wants a recommendation, is called Everywhere Present. It's a line from the Byzantine liturgy, and it's by Father Stephen Freeman. And he talks about people who have a model where they think of us living in a two-story world. So it's us here and everything supernatural is separated from us. And he says, no. God is everywhere present and filling all things. We live in a one-story universe. It's just a question of, do we actually get to encounter and experience all that this one story contains?
Mm-hmm.
What was Lewis's impulse when he realizes that he's left a bag on the train? This is sort of the beginning of a trend in this chapter. It's kind of funny.
Oh, it was immediately to go back. And I agree, the running monologue that he had in his head, first of all, I was thinking to myself, it shows how incredibly good we are as humans at rationalizing things and thinking that it's a reasonable thought. And honestly, rationalizing is probably not the right word because it's not actually rational thinking. I don't even know what you'd classify, but we just assume if it's a train of thought stringing together potential thoughts that it's somehow by definition rational, but it kind of wasn't reasonable. So yeah, you kind of see that. And it just reminded me of that spiritual battle. There's a struggle going to be going on here. And it was the same thing as the last one.
And what the heck is up with Lewis and his pack, right? In the first book, he throws his pack over the hedge to commit to being kind to a human. In this one, he leaves his pack and he wants to avoid the encounter with the divine. And so I think that he should be, he should look after his things a little better, probably.
Agreed. This section put me in mind of the excuse-making man in The Great Divorce, the one with the red lizard on his shoulder.
That's such a good one.
And we'll hear echoes of that throughout the rest of the chapter. It really does seem like he's facing some kind of offense. He speaks about a headwind that's pushing him away. And I think it's very noticeable that things are starting to become foggy. And over the course of this chapter, the mist grows as time moves on. And it's very reminiscent of how Screwtape describes their mission, to keep things foggy, to stop the patients from thinking clearly.
Yeah, clear thinking and clear perception. And David, you had that last point, which I want you to touch on because I want to jump on that really quickly.
Well, a little later, we're going to get a sort of inverted till we have faces. I knew Andrew would like this. Our narrator isn't going to hear, "Why should your heart not dance?" He's going to hear a whisper that says, "Go back, go back."
But the problem with both the narrator and with Orwell is they fail to ask the correct question, which is, I'm sorry, who's speaking, please?
Who's speaking?
Yeah, who's speaking? And if Ransom had said, hey, where does this whisper come from? Right? Let me get out of my feelings and let me be a little bit more analytical. In the same way, Orwell doesn't look at, she's on the God's mountain. She's on the mountain of love. She's on the mountain of Eros. And when she's invited, her heart is invited to dance, which is what Psyche echoes in Mere Moments. She doesn't say, oh, who is speaking? And that's part of what Ransom does until he comes to his senses.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, it seems that Ransom has been receiving angelic visitors. And it seems that the Aldila have started visiting our planet since Ransom's return. So my first question as I was reading this is, what happened to the quarantine? Because we were meant to be the silent planet. We were meant to not have any visitors to prevent the infection from spreading.
I don't think that we can properly understand the sense of global doom that happens with the world wars. We're still reeling from World War I, as I've mentioned in past episodes. And then World War II rolls around and everybody's like, oh my gosh, we're still dealing with all of that. And now we're facing it again. Virginia Woolf, when she saw the Nazi bombers flying over England, literally went down to the river, put rocks in her dress and drowned herself. She couldn't face the prospect of another war. And so it felt very apocalyptic, like things are coming to a head. Right? God is dead and, all of that and futurism. And then these wars happen that kind of defeat some of the optimism that we had at the turn of the century. And so I think that even in Lewis's mind and probably in the discussion of the Inklings, they were wondering if maybe this is the outbreak of the coming of Christ or some great benefit. And so I think the quarantine is over and things are really starting to happen. Because for them, this is a really, really dire time. And once again, remember, it's 1940, 1941 that it's being written.
My understanding with this was, I actually really liked how much he just packed into a short little section here. But
thank you. Oh, him.
Well, there's this quarantine, and he was essentially saying the Adil that are actually kind of here were mostly hostile to man. That, in fact, was why our world was cut off from communication with the other planets. He described us as being in a state of siege, enemy-occupied territory. Mm-hmm. And so then he goes on, he says, so those co-inhabiting posts on the macroscopic permeate our whole life invisibly and are the real explanation of that fatal bent, which is the main lesson of history. So this is a little bit about Thulkandra. If all this were true, then of course we should welcome the fact that the Adila of a better kind, that's who he's sensing is here with Ransom. But he doesn't really realize yet that this is a better kind yet. He's just sensing there's something here. He's going to learn here very shortly what kind it is. At least broken the frontier and we're beginning to visit us.
And you've got loads of cross-references there. He talks about us as being enemy-occupied territory. That's what he says the world is in Mere Christianity. He talks about the macroscopic, permeate our whole life invisibly. No spoilers, but you're going to hear about macrobes in the sequel, Their Hideous Strength.
Yeah.
And that last line where he talks about the fatal bent, which is the main lesson of history. In Mere Christianity, he describes it as the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy.
He's not necessarily all that excited once he actually really meets the divine. It's larger and it's scarier, and that's, we should react that way.
And as Matt would say, it's also gooder.
Touche.
So over the course of the journey, our Lewis narrator, he begins to start suspecting that everyone has bad intent. The Eldilla, Ransom, even abandoned houses. And he starts to worry about his sanity. What do you think is going on?
Well, it's similar to what happened at the beginning of Malacandra. He runs out in sheer terror and he thinks he's going crazy. And it's not until he slows down and allows the faculty of sight, he's not seeing things clearly. And of course, it's, we all have days like that. Things start to snowball, right? If we have one bad thing go on and we allow it, those bad things can start to snowball, and then we can see nothing good. And so Ransom is being given over to some kind of untoward influence, and he's not spotting it. He's not asking himself, why am I afraid? Right? He's not examining the emotion. The emotion's just guiding him, and it'll tend to run away with him, as emotion often does.
First of all, this was like deep into the psychological thriller part. And so you can sense there's genuinely a battle going on, in this case, spiritual. Now, there was a line that stuck out to me. The strength of feeling astonished me. And so this is getting to another level. A couple other things that stuck out to me that I wrote from here, this section. The reader, not knowing Ransom, will not understand how contrary to all reason this idea was. So we've just listened to this whole monologue. I should turn around. I shouldn't be doing this, all this stuff. But it was contrary to reason. It was feeling, more or less, and the brain trying to justify the feeling, more or less. I just said more or less a few times there, more or less. What enabled me to go on was the knowledge deep down inside me. This is key. So you just heard about the strength of the feeling. Now you're hearing about knowledge. It's kind of the contrary. Deep down inside me, that I was getting nearer at every stride to that one friend, to the one friend. But I felt that I was getting near to the one enemy.
Yeah.
Did I write that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyways, this whole thing culminates, by the way, with this pounding on the door in full panic, just to put in perspective. And I was there drumming on the door and ringing the handle and shouting to him to let me in as if my life depended on it. So remember, all we have is like an emotional feeling at this stage building up. There's no evidence to support this yet, technically speaking. It's just this foreign, this unknown, and this is how it culminates.
Well, and then also think about it. Will, emotion, intellect, fantasy, and Lewis strikes emotion. I think what's happening is both in that version of the Screwtape Letter in manuscript and also here is Lewis is really grappling with what to do about emotion. And I think that doesn't really get finished until he falls in love with Joy Davidman, until he writes Till We Have Faces. She begins writing poetry to him and kind of sees him as this frozen intellectual, frozen pious intellectual. And until she kind of gets her fingers through his armor and around his heart, I don't think Lewis really knows what to make of emotion until the very end of his life. And one would wish that Joy would have lived longer, as would Lewis have. And I think that he would have integrated his emotional self with the rest of his self. But I don't think that he's really all that in touch with his feelings. And that's not a typical A in UK society, upper middle class, B, somebody who survived the war, and nobody really talked about the post-traumatic stress disorder that was prevalent. And so emotions become a very unsafe place, I think, for Lewis, and he doesn't have any kind of emotional vocabulary to grapple with it. And that's some of, I think, what's going on here, and will be resolved, or at least begin to be resolved, decades later when Joy Davidman comes on the scene.
But back to our narrator, Lewis. He arrives at the cottage. Made me chuckle when I realized that he reads a ransom note. But he then goes inside the cottage. What does he find and how does he react?
I mean, first of all, I'll start with the reaction rather than what he finds. He feels like he's going into a haunted house, so he's now panicking more than ever. He was already talking about this before he gets there. He's thinking he's getting to his friend, so he's already in a full panic, even with the thought that his friend is probably there. And now it's just like a double. But in terms of what he finds, he smacks a coffin, as we will remember from, I didn't realize it at first, but as we'll realize from the previous book.
Sorry, why from the previous book?
Oh, wasn't he transported in a coffin as well?
No, it came
spaceship.
Yeah, spaceship.
Maybe.
Do you want to have another go at that?
No, we're just going to leave that blunder in. It's very characteristic of Matt.
And very much like Lewis in this chapter when he hits his shin against this thing that really looks and sounds an awful lot like a strange smelling coffin. And I've got to say, I don't know how I would react if I went to somebody's house, found them not there, walked in, it's in darkness, and then I stumble into a coffin. I would have questions.
Absolutely. Well, I think we also need to pay attention to language. And immediately the impulse to retreat, which had already assailed me several times. So there's this impulse from outside, assailing him or attacking him, leaped upon me with a sort of demoniac violence. Okay. Let's not let those words go by. In Othello, Iago says, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to this world's light. And one of the explanations, one of the great conundrums in Shakespeare studies is why is Iago so evil? But if you actually look at his language, he invokes the devil and invites the devil inside of him. And Shakespeare's writing this as somebody who believes in devils. And so there's a hint there in this language that some of this attack may be demonic.
The narrator, Lewis, then has a close encounter of the third kind. He sees what he assumes to be the Oyasa of Malacandra. Not entirely sure why he just assumes that, but what does it look like and how does he react?
I mean, he described it as a pillar of light, an inorganic voice, a color he can't describe. So it is exactly what he said earlier, a combination of material, but it feels like angelic kind of meeting each other. There's definitely a substantial, but it's nothing that he's known before or can describe, but it's also definitely something.
The pillar of light actually put me in mind of the Exodus, where there's a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud that lead the children of Israel.
Well, and then also we, in the lectionary last week, we're recording on the 12th of July. In the lectionary last Sunday, we read about Paul being caught up into the third heaven. And seeing things there that he couldn't describe. And so there's a real otherness, a real otherworldliness. Lewis wrote there's a book of Lewis's essays called Of Other Worlds. And then another one of This and Other Worlds. And another, remember, is a good word to conjure with. So he's being faced with otherworldliness. And although Ransom's familiar with it, this is the first time the narrator has encountered it.
Mm.
And this is where we get to the quote of the episode, where we talk about that he's sure that this thing is good, but he's not sure if he actually likes goodness as much as he thought he did.
We don't need to reread it necessarily, but it's like just such a truly profound section. If we extrapolate this to like our encounter with goodness, I think of these scripture verses that, of course, I don't remember exactly what they say and what they are, but they were the ones that were they're like, depending on your orientation of your heart. What I remember them saying along the lines of was, depending on your orientation of your heart, it'll be curious how much you enjoy actually encountering the divine.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just such a truth with that here. I think about this in my fear of whenever I'm flying and there's turbulence, I think I'm going to go down. I'm like sort of scared of dying just because I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen. And so I'm like, I'm not entirely sure if I want to meet Jesus right now. I don't mean that in a negative way.
Why is it so hot in here? Who is that fellow with a pitchfork?
In For Loves, he talks about love ceasing to be a demon when it ceases to be a god. And there's some hints of what Chesterton said, be careful about invoking the divine. Because if you invoke the divine, if you call on God and God actually shows up, you may not like it nearly as much as you think that you might. And you've got this sense of the really terrible, and think of terrible not as being really bad, but inspiring terror, right? It's dreadful and it's terrible, but terrible and dreadful meaning, oh my gosh, I've encountered something much bigger and a very terrible experience. Your very comforter is the one who makes you uncomfortable. There should be something in our encounters with God that inspire that kind of terror, because he is the great comforter, but you have to go through the honest terror in order to get there.
Yeah. Echoes of Isaiah, St. Peter. I did like the bit where he says, oddly enough, my very sense of helplessness saved me and steadied me. For now, I was quite obviously drawn in. The struggle was over. The next decision did not lie with me. Again, I heard surprised by joy. He's the most reluctant convert versus like, okay, it's happened. And even as he comes into the cottage, we hear that the door slams and it's like, oh, okay, what did he say earlier about being drawn in? As though the door's being slammed behind you. But this has finally happened, and it's actually now something of comfort to him.
Yeah, well, and when at last you're called on to say the thing that you have wanted to say until the word can be dug out of us, how can we know what we mean to say? And so there's this same kind of terror when Orwell meets the god of the mountain and the judge, and what she finds is not anger but mercy. But even that is just terrible for her.
Yeah, God is our only comfort. He's also the supreme terror.
Yes.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. What do you make of Lewis's reaction to Ransom's arrival? Because he says, I must tell you plainly, he says, feelings of resentment, horror, and jealousy. It was in my mind to shout out, leave your familiar alone, you damned magician, and attend to me. Because Ransom has come in and he has answered the Oyasa in Old Solar. And this is how he's reacting. But what he actually then says is, oh, Ransom, thank God you've come.
And I don't want to overlook that long footnote because this is, yeah. Do you want to have a whack at that, David?
No. You go for it, Nat Wiltius.
He talks about the Oyarsa, and then Lewis quotes this Latin writer, not Vilcius, De aethero et aereo corpore, so of the ether and the corporal air. And we learned this last week in the readings, in the liturgical readings, and the lectionary readings. There are three heavens. And so for the medievals, there's the air, then there's the ether, which is between the moon and the real heavens, and then there's the real heavens. So there are three heavens. There's the heaven up until the circle of the moon. There's the translunary, and then there's the high heaven. And so Lewis is quoting this passage in Latin and then transcribing it from an expert called Not Vilcius. But Not Vilcius is Latin for Not Whilk, which is Lewis's pseudonym, N.W., Not Whilk. And he would sometimes sign his poems as by Not Whilk. So Lewis is inventing this medieval Latin author, but he's actually writing it himself. And then quoting himself, writing about the Oyarsis. So there is no Nat Vilcius. There is no book that he's quoting from. And it's very reminiscent of his early encounter with Tolkien's poetry. When Tolkien first sent his Beren and Luthien to him, Lewis wrote back all kinds of criticism as different professors. So instead of just saying, I don't like this, I don't like that, he says, well, as Professor so-and-so says, this must be a corrupt text because the original author could never have written this or that. So it's Lewis hiding himself secretively, playfully, inventing these authorities that he's quoting from.
And it's kind of funny because you mentioned there the three heavens. Well, we actually have three layers of indirection because you have Nat Vilcius, Nat Vilk, and then Lewis himself.
Right. Well, and then narrator Lewis versus actual Lewis. And then narrator Lewis, who at the end says that he changed the names. There's 5 levels going on.
Yeah, but that doesn't fit so nicely as 3. So we're going to pretend none of that's true.
Okay. Yeah. If you want to go that way.
my systems are important to me. But we're running low on time. So is there anything else you guys would like to share before we close?
I'm just thrilled to be back in the book and to be enjoying it and rereading it. What a great excuse to revisit an old friend.
Actually, I will say this one thing. We're so grateful every one of you stopped listening, press that review button, click those stars, and then continue. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
I hear the call for the final drinks. So thank you to our intern, Julia, and our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. Thanks to our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Becca, Kevin, Mary Margaret, Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Bud 1, Bud 2, Shane, Kay, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. And of course, to all of you guys for listening and leaving a rating to us.
And actually, just before we sign off, I've got to say, when I was reading this chapter, I had to look up a word. I'd seen it often and wasn't quite sure what it was. A copse. And Matt, when your family starts growing, I'm going to call it a copse. because a copse is a little cluster of bushes.
Yes. Or trees. Copse, I thought it was, but you're probably right.
Mary Margaret's going to love that.
So please join us next time.
When we'll continue going further up
And further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.